Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. In our last class, we talked about how railroads were the first great big business in American history. Today, we're going to talk about other big businesses in American history and how that economic expansion at the end of the 19th century coincided with the development of cities and the way that the Gilded Age would emerge from there. So turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again. We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to identify the factors that combine to make the United States a mature industrial society after the Civil War. You should be able to evaluate the effectiveness of the Gilded Age political system in meeting its goals, and you should be able to examine how reformers of the period approached the problems of an industrial society. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 4. And here I'm going to talk about the Second Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution happened early in our nation's history, and it was about getting, like how factories would be developed using first water power and then steam power. But here we're going to talk about how the industrial economy would emerge into a modern economy. Because the 1880 census showed that for the first time, a majority of the workforce was engaged in non-farming jobs. This is where the scale begins to flip, where suddenly, America doesn't think of itself as an agricultural nation. Half the people aren't working in agriculture anymore. And that 2/3 of Americans were working for wage-earning jobs rather than for owning a farm or a business. The old ideal of the Jeffersonian agrarian nation, really by 1880, was a dated and outdated theory. Most manufacturing jobs were done in the industrial cities of the North, and urban growth made that industry possible. That industry then, they began to feed off of each other. The industrial capacity made it possible for cities to grow, and the cities made it possible for industry to grow from there. The South had been recovering from the Civil War, and it seriously lacked capital, so we don't really see the development happen in the South. Northerners owned 90% of the stock in all of the railroads, and that was the most profitable Southern business. So while there were businesses successful in the South, the money didn't stay reinvested in the South. It was paying the dividends of the shareholders elsewhere. Southern businesses had a number of problems that were just lagging in their economic growth, high transportation costs, and constant tariffs, and just a few skilled workers that existed in the post-Civil War South. But here I want to talk about how the spirit of innovation would begin to change things, yes, in the South, but in a broader country as well. Because there were really some important scientific breakthroughs and some real technological innovations, and those things made it possible to spur greater growth. The greatest inventor of the era was Thomas Edison, who accumulated 2,332 patents worldwide. He created the first system for electrical production and distribution. He opened the first electric generation station in Manhattan in 1882, and there he wanted to go provide power for streetcars and factories and private homes. He founded the company that would eventually become General Electric to go sell his electric equipment. Nikola Tesla was a Serbian immigrant, and he worked for Edison for a while, but he left when he felt that Edison was cheating him out of money. The subpoint C, the Depression plagued the economy, though, between 1873 and 1897. And businesses during that time were engaging in this ruthless competition with a lot of different approaches to go bring stability into an uncertain economy. As the businesses were trying to stay surviving and even to thrive in the uncertain economic environment, they took a number of approaches there, including the dividing up markets to go limit competition. They're like, companies, well, we're going to be the only ones doing it in this business area, and we'll be the ones that do it in this area over there. They would also establish what's known as a trust. Now, the term trust is going to get used a few different times in this class in different eras, but here I want to talk about this early Gilded Age version of a trust, which was a legal device that would go manage several rival companies through a single director. So there'd be one person who's managing several companies at the same time, and they all appear to be competing with each other, but they're not really. These efforts of this first generation of a trust was short-lived. As competition eventually broke up the attempts, there's only so long that they could hold this uneasy trust together. To avoid cutthroat competition, though, more and more corporations began to battle to control entire industries altogether, saying that that's really the future of American economic growth, was not being the only country in this region, but to be the only country operating in this industry. The efforts between 1897 and 1904, so in that 8 or 10 year period there, 4,000 firms were vanishing into larger corporations in this early move of mergers. Subpoint D. Here I want to introduce a term to you known as the robber barons. The robber barons were these, industrialists, and we've got some specific ones in mind. The first person I want you to meet is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland, and he was born to penniless parents. And at age 12 years old, his parents brought him over to the United States in 1848. By the time he was 18 years old, so in just 6 years of span, he became a private secretary to a local leader in a Pennsylvania railroad, essentially, like a personal assistant. He famously helped fix a snarled mess of passenger and freight trains one time when there was like this, big lag, and he just got sat down to the telegraph machine, and you move here, and you move here, and you move here. And he famously helped fix this snarled mess of trains. And then his boss, in order to say thank you, said, well, that was good work, and maybe we could offer you some ownership of the company if you could go buy shares into the company. His mother leaped at the idea and mortgaged the house to go buy shares of the company, eventually making Carnegie into a self-made rags to riches millionaire. By the 1890s, Carnegie was dominating the steel industry, making use of the technique of vertical integration. So he makes the jump from the railroad business to the steel industry. And what we really associated with Carnegie is this idea of vertical integration, where Carnegie wanted to own all of the phases of business of the steel production company. He owned the mines that would go mine the ore. He would own the railroads that it would travel on, the coals that were, like the coal mines where they would mine the coal to go drive the railroads to go from there. The distribution networks, all of that would be owned entirely by Carnegie along the way. That's vertical integration. Carnegie's life reflected this desire to go succeed at all costs, and his desire to go give back to society as well. As a young boy, he and other young boys were allowed access to, there was a colonel that was there, and he was retired, and he had a nice private library, and Carnegie just loved that idea. And a privilege Carnegie took well advantage of, and then he always promised to repay it one day. By 1929, Carnegie was so committed to this idea of literacy and libraries, he had helped build over 2,500 libraries in all of the United States of America. The next person I want you to meet is John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller, he's a fascinating guy. While most big businesses built their wealth through vertical integration, oil magnate Rockefeller used horizontal integration instead, driving out rival firms through cutthroat competition and buying out any competing refineries until he ran 90% of the entire oil industry. Rockefeller profited by paying low wages to his employees, and underselling any of his competitors. Once he controlled a market, then he raised the prices. Basically, once he had driven out any competition and there wasn't anybody, pricing against him, he would bring up the prices to whatever he saw fit. Critics called these industrialists robber barons. It's not a polite term to be a robber baron. They were like barons in a feudal system because they robbed the public to take it. Industrialists also became philanthropists, and we see this a little bit with Carnegie and the Carnegie libraries, giving large portions of their wealth to go create universities and hospitals and foundations. A lot of those leaders ended up with a more flattering nickname. Those were called captains of industry. Subpoint E. Here I want to talk about the class divisions in the industrial age as well. Many of the wealthiest Americans were consciously pursuing an aristocratic lifestyle. Take, for instance, the economist Thorstein Veblen. Veblen noted that the upper class was spending money not on their needs or, frankly, even their wants, but on what he referred to as conspicuous consumption. Just buying stuff to show people that they're rich, spending money so that others would know their wealth. For skilled workers, the rapidly expanding industrial system brought new forms of freedom. A lot of people saw their work week shortened by 10 hours while still commanding high wages and good working conditions. So you get some class divisions here moving on, like the upper crust, they could just spend some money. And the middle class of the skilled workers, they're seeing their life get real improvement too, with fewer and fewer hours in the clock, but more and more pay coming in for it. But for most workers, economic insecurity really was a fact of life, particularly in the Depression of the 1870s through the 1890s. Between 1880 and 1900, an average of 35,000 workers perished every year in factory and mine accidents. It was the highest rate of workplace deaths in the industrialized world. The working class typically lived in pretty desperate living conditions as well. Famously documented by the photographer Jacob Riis in his book How the Other Half Lived, showing what it was like to have people actually living these lives of poverty so far removed from the wealth of the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. Subpoint F. As the United States matured into an industrial economy, Americans struggled to make sense of this new social order. Americans seemed to sense that something had gone wrong in the nation's development, that it just wasn't the way that people imagined the country should be. People talked about belonging to the better classes, and they mean that not just better off wealth, but actually thinking that these classes of people are better people, but also the respectable classes and even the dangerous classes. Americans believed the concentration of wealth was just one of those things that was going to be inevitable and natural and maybe even justified by progress. And failure to advance in society was because, widely thought that was just because of a lack of character. Like, poor people are just poor because they kind of suck at life, not really considering any other conditions that would go along the way. Subpoint G. While Charles Darwin was putting forth the theory of evolution, where plants and animals would, their species would adapt to the environment, and the best suited of them would survive. Here we take that biological principle of, the Darwinism of evolution, and it became known, there was kind of a derivation of it called social Darwinism, and it was a pseudo-scientific theory that really didn't have much basis in fact to it, but it was very persuasive. And social Darwinism argued that evolution was a natural progress in human society, just like it was in the natural world, and that government must not interfere with it, and if poor people are going to run out of money and fail, then they should just run out of money and fail, that's just the scientific thing that should happen. It was also called social evolution, and social Darwinism misapplied that theory of biological evolution where the best adapted animal would survive. The idea of the survival and the success of the fittest and the most capable, it was very appealing, particularly to rich people who wanted to think that, like, oh yes, well, I'm just better at being rich than other people. And they could justify their success on a fact of nature, and it's not even their fault, and exploiting is, that's just the way the scientific world works. Some people saw it as a validation of the old Protestant work ethic, which had been hanging around American theological circles for quite a long time, that riches were a sign of God's favor. Therefore, the poor must be not only inferior, because they're not as well advanced, but also morally inferior. Like, God just doesn't seem to like them as much. Economists use the idea of social Darwinism to justify the doctrine of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French term, but when you hear laissez-faire, I just want you to think hands off. Like, nobody's enforcing the rules because there really shouldn't be any rules. That's the idea of laissez-faire. And economists use this idea of social Darwinism to enforce the doctrine of laissez-faire government action in businesses. Gilded Age social Darwinists believe that the lower classes were a threat to democracy, and poor people are just, they're going to bring the whole country down. Individual liberty, the idea of private property, and they proposed a return to voting being limited to property owners, and even stripping the franchise away from poor people because poor people just seem so incompetent at doing things, was the argument of the social Darwinists here in this Gilded Age era. And that's where I want to take us to subpoint 5, or Roman numeral number 5, politics of the Gilded Era. And I've used this term now a couple of times, gilding. Gilding is actually an artistic technique. You'll find it being done in construction as well. It's a process of adding a very thin layer of gold to a surface. And it makes something, kind of simple look very expensive. You could take plaster or wood and put a real thin layer of gold over it. You can even paint the gold onto it. And it makes something like, oh, that's very wealthy. But the wealth is very, very shallow. And this term comes down to us from the author Mark Twain, who coined the term the Gilded Age, as if, the society of America looked like it was prosperous, but just scratch the surface, and you see that it's not much holding it up underneath to describe the shallow economics and political life of the late 1800s. And because political corruption was rife, and that's really the characteristic of the Gilded Age, the political corruption. After the Civil War, political machines were gaining control of all of the major cities in America. Each machine was using an organized group of people to control a particular political party in a city. And there were political machines, the Democrats and the Republicans. It's not like one party was more corrupt than the other in the Gilded Age. Political machines used electoral fraud to go win elections and took kickbacks and bribes to allow illegal activities and legal activities that needed to be supervised. They would take kickbacks to go ignore all of them. Machines were highly organized with precinct captains and ward bosses and a city boss that would go direct to the politics of that town. And they would use graft to make all of this possible. Graft, it's a term worth knowing, is the illegal use of political influence for personal gain. Whether or not the city boss served as the mayor, and sometimes they were the mayor and sometimes they just owned a mayor, he controlled access to city jobs. The boss controlled access to city jobs and to business licenses. The city boss would influence the courts and the municipal agencies and arranged for building projects and community services, and the city boss pretty much ran the city. Most sizable cities had a boss. The most famous famous boss was New York City's Boss Tweed, whose ring plundered the city for millions of dollars along the way. Boss Tweed was ousted in the 1870s, but the city's poor thought of him like Robin Hood, as a guy that could go deliver on their promises. Corruption existed at the national level too. This wasn't just a local issue. Subpoint B, lawmakers supported the bills that benefited the companies they owned, or they took salary from the companies they were supposed to be regulating along the way. The great example of this is a company called Credit Mobilier. Credit Mobilier was a construction company that was formed by the owners of the Union Pacific Railroad. So the Union Pacific Railroad, they're like driving the trains, right? But the construction company that would go lay the tracks was known by Credit Mobilier. And they would get certain like benefits from the government. They would get land payouts and tax perks and all of those things to go help develop the infrastructure of the country. And Credit Mobilier was a construction company that was formed by the owners of the Union Pacific Railroad. And it allowed participants to go basically sign contracts with themselves and then overpay for track and then go charge the government for the difference and then pocket the high profits along the way. Shares of the stock were offered to most important Republican politicians, protecting Credit Mobilier from any of the government inquiry because they wouldn't get investigated if the lawmakers, the ones that would be doing the investigations, were the ones profiting from the company. It included all the way up the chain of command until you get to President Grant's vice president, not Grant himself, but his vice president was caught up in the Credit Mobilier scandal as well. Grant's administration had other problems, like what was known as the whiskey ring. The whiskey ring was made up of tax collectors whose job it was to go collect taxes from distillers, people like whiskey makers. And then it was also like these Republican officials who were defrauding the government of millions of dollars in taxes and basically taking kickbacks from the distillers to say like, hey, well, you don't pay the taxes if you just go pay. Here's the microphone. How about that? Mr. Bradfield, go to the front office. Okay, the Grant administration whiskey ring has these tax collectors, and they ended up defrauding the government out of money as well. Subpoint C. James Garfield's political career, and here I want to introduce James Garfield. James Garfield's political career was heavily intertwined with what was known as the spoils system. The spoils system was this system of politics, and he almost saw his political career cut short by the Credit Mobilier affair. The scheme implicated Grant's vice president and several members of Congress, including Garfield at the time. So when Garfield goes and tries to survive in politics and move on from there, people who wanted to maintain this patronage system, this spoils system, and I'll say more about this in a second, they were known as the stalwarts. The stalwarts were a name, it suggests that people wanted to just keep things the way they are, maintain the system. That's the idea of a stalwart. And reformers, or particularly Republicans, they were these moderate Republicans who wanted to reform the old spoils system. They were known as half-breeds, and it was like this insulting name, like you're not really even a Republican, you're like a half-breed Republican because you want to end the patronage system. By the 1880 election, Garfield's experience with Credit Mobilier scandal had made him into a reformer, going from a stalwart position into this half-breed reformer's position. And he runs for president in 1880. His vice president that year was a guy named Chester A. Arthur, and Arthur was a stalwart, one of the old guard, right, who wanted to maintain this spoils system along the way. And it was a compromise pick because the Republican Party puts two unlike people together to go gain the most votes. Okay. The spoils system. We've used this term, I think, before, but let's go ahead and pick up our definition on it. The spoils system is the idea that when a person wins office, and usually we're talking about an executive position here, so like a president or a governor or whatever, to the victor goes the spoils, and the president gets to go appoint all the people that he wants to the positions that he sees fit for them, whether or not they're actually qualified for the position. And it often turns out that the president's political lackeys get appointed to those positions, and they're not super qualified for it, and that's known as the spoils system, and it's rife for corruption. It's one of the hallmarks of the Gilded Age. So here you have Garfield, who wants to reform that spoils system, and his vice presidential candidate is Chester A. Arthur. It is stalwart, and they're kind of lumped together and both on the Republican ticket for president in 1880. At some point before the 1880 campaign, a guy named Charles Guiteau had wrote this letter, and it was more like a pamphlet, a rambling, incoherent speech of an 1880 candidate of Ulysses S. Grant. They were trying to get Grant to go run for a third term for office again, and Guiteau wanted to go see Grant win, so he writes this pamphlet, and he was trying to circulate it around to go stir up interest in Grant's political career. But when the Republican Party ended up nominating Garfield instead of Grant, Guiteau said, well, it's still a pretty good pamphlet. And he just goes through and crosses out all of the Grants and clumsily just puts in Garfield instead. And he printed it as a campaign flyer. When Garfield and Arthur won office, Charles Guiteau was like, hey, I wrote a pamphlet for you in support, and he expected to go be named to an important ambassadorship. He specifically wanted to be ambassador of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Eastern Europe. But he informed the State Department, hey, well, if that one's taken, understand, I'm willing to work with you here. And he said I would settle for France as a second choice from there. Guiteau badgered the Garfield administration, saying, hey, spoil system, this is the way it works. And Garfield, I know you're a half-breed, but you're really a stalwart at heart, and your vice president's a stalwart as well. And Guiteau's like, I wrote the pamphlet, you ought to be able to do it. And he badgers the Garfield administration for work. And the Garfield administration says, Guiteau, I don't actually know who you are, and was told to leave and never return again. And all of a sudden, Guiteau has the switch flip on in his brain. Guiteau's rejection triggered the inner demons that he was of a pretty already deluded psyche along the way, and he plotted assassination of Garfield. He openly imitated his intentions to the president. He wrote threatening letters to the Secretary of State. He stalked the president's movements around Washington, even giving up one strike because he didn't want Mrs. Garfield to go witness her husband's death. Guiteau also attempted to visit the jail that he, if he kills the president, he knows that he's going to go to jail for it. He's like, maybe I should go check out the jail cell and go see my beautiful life ahead of me. He even bought this is not a rational man. He even bought a specific gun because he thought it would look beautiful in a museum. And this is going to be guy that they're going to always remember, the man that assassinated Garfield. Guiteau attempted to go do so, and on July 2nd of 1881, Charles Guiteau saw President Garfield as he boarded a train. Guiteau just casually approached Garfield on the train platform, and then he drew his pistol and shot Garfield from behind at point-blank range. In a determined calm, Guiteau then marched towards the exit of the station, where a nearby police officer came and arrested him. Turning to the confused and horrified crowd, Charles Guiteau shouted his response. He shouted his purpose. He says, I am the stalwart of stalwarts. Arthur is president. He expected the stalwarts to go welcome him as a hero. He even wrote to General William Tecumseh Sherman saying, hey, Sherman, you're a stalwart. I need you to bring out your troops and go spring me out of jail. Here's the thing, though. Garfield didn't die. At least he didn't die right away. With modern medicine, he might have even survived. His condition was complicated by the doctors who used unsterilized tools and fingers. This was really before modern germ theory. And they kept poking around Garfield's body to go find the bullet. Inventor Alexander Graham Bell even invented a metal detector so they could go find the bullet in his body and go dig it out. It didn't occur to anybody that Garfield was laying on a bed with metal springs all through it, and the device never could locate the bullet, but they did keep poking around in the hole to go find it. Garfield lingered in pain for almost 3 months, 80 days, eventually dying not of the gunshot wound directly, but of blood poisoning and infection as a result of his attempted treatments, subpoint E. Though Chester Arthur had been a stalwart, once he becomes president by killing the half-breed, as a result of corrupt patronage, there's really no way that Chester A. Arthur can continue to be a stalwart instead. He reacted to Guiteau's efforts in basically the only way that he could. He repudiated patronage, he embraced the reformer agenda, and Garfield goes and he becomes a reformer as well. Half-breed Republicans and anti-patronage Democrats, they teamed up together and formed bipartisan legislation with Arthur's help of the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, which imposed all its restrictions on party influence on appointments and setting up a structure for government positions contingent on a merit-based civil service exam. Patronage still exists somewhat in our government today at levels, a variety of efforts, but it's not as nearly as widespread, and it turns out that government employees, while they might get appointed for political reasons, are still expected to be competent in their job. Roman numeral number 6. Here I want to talk about labor. And when I talk about labor, we're beginning to use some class structures that make it sound like the working class is a unique group of society. And there's a lot of people that certainly think about it this way, and it emerges in our time. So when I talk about labor, I'm talking about the working class of people, and we're also talking about unions and organized labor along the way. So Roman numeral number 6, labor in the Republic. In 1887, the Great Railroad Strike was the first major labor strike in America. These railroad workers all joined together to go strike against their treatment. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad went on strike to protest their second wage cut in 2 months. And the work stoppage, not just in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, began to carry over to other railroads along the way. And it spread to other lines, which caused this shutdown of freight and passenger train for, freight for 50,000 miles around the country. And for an entire week, governor said that the strike was now impeding interstate commerce. This is no longer about Baltimore and Ohio and just kind of like you were talking about a national shutdown, and governor said, hey, federal government, you need to step in on this one. Along the way, they called for federal troops to go intervene and end the strike. Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877 ordered in the army to go put down the strike, and said, if you're going to strike, then we'll send in the army to go force you back to work or go run the trains for you. Subpoint B. Here I want to talk about a labor union known as the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor were the first big labor union that emerged out of it. And the Knights of Labor was a labor union that organized all the workers in various industries to go improve social conditions along the way. They're the first to go organize unskilled laborers as well as skilled laborers, and there's a difference between those two. But men and women could both belong to the Knights of Labor, and African Americans and white people could be in, not Asians. The Knights are only so modern, I guess? I don't know. The labor movement raised the issue of whether or not meaningful freedom could even exist in a situation of extreme economic inequality, an argument that was often lost in that talk of social Darwinism. And social Darwinists would have said, well, why are workers even organizing as well? They're obviously holding those jobs because they just shouldn't hold good jobs. And that's kind of the Knights of Labor. They're the first real great labor union in American history. Subpoint C. You also see some attempts at moral reform that come from a theological point of view as well. A Christian lobby of mainstream Protestants sought political answers to the moral dilemmas that they were observing as a result of labor strife and urbanization. And here I want you to meet the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They and others, they formed what they thought of as moral suasion, trying to persuade people from moral points of view, to campaign for federal legislation to outlaw the consumption of alcohol in particular, which they said was at the heart of so many societal ills. But also prostitution and gambling and birth control and polygamy. They were all of these behaviors that moral reformers wanted to end. Protestants of what they termed the Bible Belt, a string of states in the road that were all part of this Protestant movement, this Bible Belt. They joined the campaign for federal regulations of individual morality and breaking with the white Southerners' states' rights tradition and saying, no, for this kind of thing, this needs national leadership for something like prohibition. Subpoint D. And here I want to introduce a term known as the social gospel. Remember this term. We're going to use it a few more times in the future of this history class. And here I want to introduce Walter Rauschenbusch. Walter Rauschenbusch, I think is how you say that, he insisted that freedom and spiritual self-development required an equalization of wealth and power, and that unbridled competition actually mocked the Christian ideal of brotherhood. These social gospelists, which, Rauschenbusch is one of them, they came to believe that salvation came through service to the poor. And here I want to take a minute and have a little bit of an important distinction on this. Jesus specifically did instruct people to go care for the poor and made it pretty clear that Christians are expected to both love their neighbors and their enemies, but it's bad theology to think that someone can earn their way into heaven with charitable work. And it reduces religion to merely nothing but a non-governmental organization. Social gospel adherents established the important mission and relief programs in urban areas. Rauschenbusch tended to think that it was, social care for the poor that gave Christianity meaning, but I think we should probably more specifically say that, no, it's Christianity that gives this type of social work meaning, and that's an important distinction. Subpoint E. On May 1st of 1886, some 350,000 workers in cities across the country demonstrated for an 8-hour workday. This was, inspired by the 1877 Great Railroad Strike, and it was trying to have a nationwide movement for an 8-hour workday. And on May 4th of that year, of 1886, strikers gathered in Chicago, in a particular neighborhood of Chicago known as the Haymarket Square. And there they intended to go protest police brutality. Even though the protest was peaceful, nervous policemen went and descended on the protest to go break it up. And when that happened, it sparked violence. It's kind of a strange irony on this. The protest was against police brutality. It's a peaceful protest. The police come in, and suddenly it's not a peaceful protest anymore. Someone, and no one's ever been able to determine who, threw a bomb, and it killed a policeman along the way. In the ensuing violent chaos, 8 people ended up getting arrested and charged and convicted, and even executed for inciting a riot. Employers took the opportunity to say, okay, so this is what happens when you have a labor movement. This is what happens when you have people like the Knights of Labor out there agitating for an 8-hour 8-hour workday, you end up with violent demonstrations. And it said that basically the labor movement now is dangerous and un-American, and it's an un-American force prone to violence, and it's controlled by foreign-born radicals. And public opinion really began to turn now against the labor movement. 7 of the 8 men accused of plotting the Haymarket bombing were foreign-born, and now you've got like this nativism and anti-labor movement, and they all get kind of caught up, and this just seems un-American to some people, subpoint F. In 1892, the Carnegie steelworkers went on strike for themselves, and they went over strike on pay cuts. The company president, a guy named Henry Frick, he hired armed security guards from a group known as the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And there, these armed security guards, their job was to go intimidate strikers and go break up the strike. And then he hired people to go take their jobs for him, known as scabs. The scabs would go and take the jobs that the strikers weren't doing. And so so Frick hires the scabs to go into work and to keep the company operating, because the point of the strike was to go shut down the company from there. The striking mob then goes and attacks the Pinkertons, these hired not really detectives, but like hired bodyguards, right? The striking mob attacks the armed bodyguards, and he kills 3 of the workers, 3 of the guards, and 9 of the workers get killed along the way. And the National Guard has to get called in, and all of this is the Carnegie steel strike. Andrew Carnegie, who we met earlier in this very episode, is the focus of this labor strike. And, the National Guard had to come in and go protect the strikers, and then force the plant to go reopen along the way. And the Carnegie strike was a failed strike, and it continued for a few more months after that, but really the power of the union was broken, and the workers wouldn't go and have a successful remobilized effort for almost a half a century after that. This idea of expansion of business and the uneasy relationship between the poor and the rich, and this story is going to play out 100 times, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.